Ko Chris Farr for you.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, to take a call on part 3 of this piece of legislation. Before I look towards a specific clause, Mr Chair, I do want to just point out one thing that the previous speaker said. I'm going to have to look back at some of the media at the time when the national government increased GST from 12.5% to 15%, because I didn't see them pushing very hard that GST had to go up to incentivise savings. I don't remember that being one of the National Party key lines. We need to increase GST so more Kiwis will save. I'll come back to the House and see how that Google search goes for how many times the Prime Minister said that or the Finance Minister said that GST had to go up so Kiwis could save more. We don't want people to spend so much. God forbid we go out there and buy food. So GST has to go up from 12.5% to 15% because that was what the member who just resumed his seat said. Mr Chair, I do want to go to clause 48 of the bill, and it's something that no one else has raised in clause 1, subclause 1, which inserts a new 10B. And for the benefit of the House, that says, and I think the member and the Chair may take some interest in this, for the purposes of this Act, when a person who is resident in New Zealand pays an amount of money to participate in gambling or in a prize competition through a supply of remote services, which have already been described in this debate, that are physically performed outside New Zealand, the payment is treated as a payment for a supply of service by the person who conducts the gambling or prize competition as applicable. Now, in English, that means that if someone were a New Zealander here, someone resident in New Zealand, were to go and gamble on a race on an online betting site based in either in Australia or in the UK, currently my understanding is there is no GST charged on that bet. If they were to use their phone and place a similar bet on a race here in New Zealand, they are charged GST. So there's a disparity between the experience with the New Zealand TAB, what we all know as a place to go and put a bet on, and overseas betting websites that take bets from New Zealand. So there was a submission from the New Zealand Racing Board, and I think this is a good part of the legislation, Mr Chair, where they talked about the imbalance there and some revenue that the Racing Board could be missing out on. And if I can turn to the submission from the Racing Board, because I think it's a good one, point 4.1 said that the Racing Board estimated that New Zealanders are betting $58 million annually, and that's 15% of their total expenditure by New Zealand on overseas websites. They went on to say that the New Zealand community receives no benefit from that activity because all that money goes overseas, no GST, so none of it comes back to New Zealand, but it does incur costs associated with problem gambling. And they went on to say that they've calculated that the loss of GST revenue on that $58 million, Mr Chair, could be close to $8 million. So the foregone revenue from not charging GST on bets placed on overseas websites, on overseas gambling websites, will be close to $8 million that the government would miss out on. They believe that if that money went back to New Zealand, obviously $8 million to the government in revenue, that of that $58 million, the sports like the likes of rugby league, basketball, cricket, who do allow sports betting on their events, would get an additional $5 million because the Racing Board pays them a fee on those events. And the racing industry itself would get close to $40 million more if that revenue was staying here in New Zealand, which I think, within this piece of legislation, is a good thing because it's my understanding that GST will be now charged on betting on overseas websites. They went on to say later on in their submission, Mr Chair, that this differential in competitiveness, that GST was a factor here, and that in respect of the New Zealand Racing Board is no different to any other retailer in suffering a competitive disadvantage and being required to charge GST while offshore providers do not. So, Mr Chair, I think this is a good addition and a good change to the piece of legislation because it does give that New Zealand entity, the TAB or the New Zealand Racing Board, the ability to take away that competitive disadvantage that it has, Mr Chair, that competitive disadvantage that it is experiencing with the leakage of betting money going overseas. It's not just an issue just around GST. I think they are now predicting that it's up somewhere around $500 million that we could lose over the next 5 or 6 years from the sports betting industry itself, and a big chunk of that obviously with the racing industry, if we don't attend the issue of leakage from New Zealanders betting on overseas websites. Can I turn now to the other issue around retail in general, which has been raised by other members on this side of the House. Now, I'm a bit of a laggard. I like to see and feel things when I buy them from the shop. I don't buy a lot online, unlike Fletcher Tabato, who I believe buys his CD, downloads his CDs online. I don't know how that happens. Maybe he's got one of those 3D printers and that's how he does it. But I don't do a lot of online shopping. I like to support local business and make sure that I can see and things fit. Or the book that I like my colleague here, Grant Robertson, I like to hold the book. I don't like to have a tablet or something to read a book. But I think this piece of legislation that we see here today is a start, but misses a trick because it hasn't gone far enough. And I think Retail New Zealand and their submission made that point strongly, that yes, we've made a start with these intangible goods or intangible services, the likes of Netflix, and I think the likes of Spark will be happy because their alternative lightbox they were charging GST, and that, again, like the TAB example, put them at a competitive disadvantage to the likes of Netflix, who have can come not only with their content, which is arguably a bigger range of content and a competitive advantage there, but also in their pricing, having to price with a GST component worked into their pricing, but not for the likes of Netflix. My mother always was a good gardener, and she said if you start a job, do it properly. And that's why she never let me do the gardens, because I'd never do it properly. And I think we've got another example of this here in this piece of legislation. It's a good start, but we haven't gone far enough to make sure we're looking seriously at the issue around the tangible goods that could be picked up from online purchasing. And I pick up on the point that many other people on this side of the House have said around that's worked to the detriment of retail, certainly in my area of Mana, where I think you're seeing some retailers really struggling on the street now, because people are looking offshore because the range and the price might be better. They might have to deal with that and look at how they compete product to product. But when you are looking at a 15% price differential, that's hard to go up against. And I think that's probably why you will see an increase, and people like me might have to start looking at online as a more serious option. But I think we need to cut those small to medium retailers a break, as was submitted by Retail New Zealand, and say, look, if we're going to start this process, let's do it properly, and not just take the low-hanging fruit of the intangible services that are contained in this piece of legislation, but let's do it properly and look how we deal with this issue to make sure that small businesses who do want to set up in our cities and in our towns don't have a massive disadvantage for them there. So I'd like to maybe ask a question to the Minister and the Chair, and what work has been done on how much priority has this government going to put on that continuing work, which I think is the hard stuff, instead of just concentrating on the easy stuff here, which is the intangibles, and to make life better or easier for those retailers in our small towns and our cities.
Mr. Chair. I call Stuart.